Go ahead.
Miss Pryor, before the break, you said that you were told that Gavin had broken his arm at a baseball game, right?
Yes.
Who told you that?
Janet did.
Did Gavin ever tell you that?
No.
Was Gavin there when Janet told it to you?
I don't know. It was over the phone.
Okay, and did she tell you exactly how he had broken his arm in the baseball game?
She told me he was running to catch the ball, and his glove was worn through. Something about a worn-out glove.
Okay, and did she tell you in that conversation that the family needed money for baseball equipment?
No, she didn't. When she told me, I told her, Janet, if you need anything, you can ask me. I said, anything for the kids. I said, if Gavin needs a glove, then let me know.
Did Janet tell you Gavin needed a glove?
No.
Did she ever tell you he needed anything related to baseball?
No.
Okay, what about any equipment or uniforms or anything of that sort?
No.
Okay, did she tell you why she was telling you he had broken his arm in a baseball game?
Your Honor, I'm going to object. Calls for a conclusion. Speculation.
Overruled. You may answer.
Can you repeat that?
Yes. Did Janet give you any indication why she was telling you that Gavin had broken his arm in a baseball game?
I would think she told me just because we would talk about the kids. And, you know, with a child breaking a bone, that's pretty serious.
Did she ever tell you he had broken a bone anywhere else?
Not that I can remember, no.
Did she ever tell you he had broken a bone in a parking lot?
I don't remember if she said Gavin or Star did, but one of them did break a bone, she told me, when they were younger.
Okay, did she ever mention any altercation with security guards anywhere?
No.
Did she ever tell you she had filed any lawsuit of any kind?
No.
Now, you did give a Christmas gift, right?
Yes.
And you indicated this was after Janet had discussed some financial problems they were having, right?
Yes.
And approximately what year did you give a gift to them?
The gift of $600?
Yes.
That was in December of 2001.
Okay, did you give $600 in cash or did you give a check?
It was a cashier's check.
Who did you give it to?
Janet.
Okay.
I mailed it to her.
Okay, and did she ever thank you for it?
Yes.
Alright, now, did you give Janet this check before or after you knew there were fundraisers for Gavin's illness?
Well, I knew there had been a fundraiser when I first met Gavin, so therefore I gave her the $600 after I knew about it. Now, if I gave it to her before or after she told me about them, I don't remember.
Okay, now, you knew that Chris Tucker had gone to the fundraiser, right?
Yes.
And did you learn whether or not he had given them any financial assistance?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay, do you recall whether or not Devellin ever asked you for a car?
If she asked me for a car?
Yes.
Yes.
When was that?
This was in February of 2003.
Okay, and explain what she asked you.
She didn't ask me to give her the car out of the blue. There had been a discussion about them receiving a car of mine from Chris.
And who did you have that discussion with?
Janet.
What did Janet say about that?
She thanked me profusely for giving them the car. I knew nothing about it until they actually told me. Chris had not even told me. They told me.
So Janet thanked you for giving her a car?
For giving her the car, yes.
Had you given her a car?
I had not given it to her yet.
Were you surprised when she thanked you for giving her a car that you never gave her?
Obviously I was a little surprised. However, I felt like, I kind of knew it was coming, because Chris had spoken about it before, that he wanted to help them out. He knew that Janet was taking Gavin to his weekly doctor appointments on the bus.
Is that what Janet told him?
Yes.
So it's in approximately February of 2003 that she thanks you for the car?
Yes. She told me that Chris said he would give them the car. And she called me to thank me, and I guess I assumed to ask when it was going to be handed over to her.
And what did you say to her?
The car was not in my name, so I told her it needed to be changed. She needed to wait till Chris got back in town to switch the registration and everything.
Was it your intention to give them the car?
No, not necessarily.
Did you ever give them a car?
No.
Did Janet ever ask you for a car on another occasion?
No.
How many phone conversations did you have with Janet when she asked you for a car?
Too many to remember. I don't know.
What do you mean by that?
A lot of times. If Janet wouldn't call me, Devellin would call me.
Asking you for a car?
For the car.
And did Devellin act as if they owned the car?
No, I think it was more so they just wanted to know when they were going to get it, to gain possession of the car.
And during these many conversations, what would you tell them about the car?
It was out of my hands. There was nothing I could do about it.
Is that what you said to them?
I told them they had to wait on Chris.
At some point, did they stop calling you and asking for a car?
Well, yes.
Approximately what was that?
The last conversation I had with Devellin, which was in April of 2003, I believe.
Okay.
That was the last time I talked to her.
Was it your choice not to talk to her anymore?
No, not at all.
Why did you stop talking to her?
I have no idea.
Did they stop calling you?
Yes.
Did you stop calling them?
I didn't have a number to reach them.
Okay, if you can guess, how many times do you think Janet asked you for a car?
If it was my guess, I would say anywhere from 7 to 10 times.
And did this all happen in the year 2003?
Yes.
If you can estimate, how many times did Devellin ask you for a car?
I don't remember. I know Devellin would leave me messages, because I wouldn't always answer the phone. So there were numerous messages.
Okay, and in those numerous messages, was Devellin requesting the car?
Yes.
And all this was in the year 2003?
This was all in February.
February of 2003? Okay, now, did Janet tell you in February of 2003 that they had no car?
Yes.
Did Devellin tell you in February of 2003 that they had no car?
Yes.
Alright, in any of these phone conversations, were Janet and Devellin on the phone together?
No, there was no kind of three-way or two different phones where they were. You know, I would maybe start on the phone with Devellin and she would hand the phone to her mom, or vice versa.
Do you recall whether or not Gavin was ever on the phone when you were asked to give them a car?
I don't remember Gavin ever even mentioning the car to me.
How about Star?
I don't remember Star either.
Okay. Now, you saw the Arvizo children at Chris Tucker's home, correct?
Correct.
And could you describe their behavior?
I don't like to call people's kids bad, but Gavin and Star really needed attention, I felt like.
In what?
They really needed attention.
What do you mean by that?
You know, they would do little things, very mischievous. One time I remember us sitting down in front of Chris's big screen television and there was a drink on the floor. I don't remember what it was. But Gavin, I saw him look at the glass and I saw him just kind of do his foot and kick it over and then act like it was an accident, you know, just to get that reaction out of us. Like, Gavin, you know, what happened? You know, they would do little things like that. Or, you know, like I said, roughhousing, just playing around. I mean, they were kids. You know, I think at the time they were maybe 11 or 12. I don't remember.
Would you describe them as well-behaved?
At times. But I think that they lacked discipline.
And what do you mean by that?
I think that anytime I saw David Arvizo with his kids, I never saw him discipline them, even when they got out of hand. And I think, because Gavin was sick, I think that he did not discipline them when I felt like they needed it at times.
Now, at any time did Janet tell you that Star had a cyst in his brain?
Your Honor, I'm going to object as hearsay.
Impeachment? Your Honor.
There's no.
Sustained.
Did you ever learn whether or not Star had a cyst on his brain?
Object. Lack of foundation. Immaterial. Irrelevant.
Overruled. You may answer.
Did I learn Star had a cyst?
Yes.
Not that I can recall.
Did Janet ever say anything like that?
I object. Hearsay.
Sustained.
Okay. Do you recall when the, or what has become known as the Bashir documentary was aired?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Did you ever hear of something called the Bashir documentary?
Yes.
And when did you learn about that?
I learned about it when I watched it on television.
And do you know approximately when that was?
In early February.
After the Bashir documentary aired, did you speak to any of the Arvizos?
Yes.
Who did you speak to?
Devellin.
Okay. Did she call you?
Yes.
And did she talk about the documentary?
Yes, she did.
What did she say?
Object. Hearsay.
Sustained.
Did you ever talk to Janet about the Bashir documentary?
Yes.
When was this?
After it aired. Maybe the same conversation when Devellin first called me.
Now, who called you?
Devellin did.
Okay. And did she discuss the Bashir documentary?
Yes, she did.
Okay. And do you know where Devellin was living at the time?
No, I don't.
Was she living at her grandmother's, to your knowledge?
Object. Leading.
Sustained.
Do you know where Janet and the boys were living?
At the time when they called me?
Yes.
After the documentary?
Yes.
No, I don't know.
After the Bashir documentary aired, did Janet ever tell you they were spending a lot of time with Major J. Jackson?
Object. Calls for hearsay.
Sustained.
Do you know whether or not, after the Bashir documentary aired, if the Arvizos were spending time with Major Jackson?
Object. Lack of foundation.
Sustained.
You mentioned that you met Major Jackson on a bus, right?
Yes.
And that was the bus.
Excuse me. I'm going to object as a misstatement of the testimony with regard to the rank in the last name.
Overruled. You may answer.
Did you meet Major Jackson on a bus?
Yes.
And that was to go to the birthday party at Neverland, right?
Yes.
Did you ever see him again after that?
No.
Did you ever speak to him on the phone?
No.
Did you ever meet Janet Arvizo at an address where Mr. Jackson lived?
I don't know. It would be my guess that the apartment on St. Andrews that I met them at for an interview would be Jay's apartment, but no one told me that. Or if they did, I don't remember.
Okay, so the only time you ever saw Jay was at the birthday party?
Correct.
Okay, now, did you talk to Janet about the Bashir documentary?
Yes, I did.
What did she say to you?
Object. Hearsay.
It's impeachment, Your Honor.
I can't tell really. The question is too general. I'll sustain the objection.
Okay. Did Janet ever complain to you about the Bashir documentary?
Yes.
Object. Hearsay.
You're offering this for impeachment?
Yes, Your Honor, yes.
All right, I'll overrule the objection.
You can answer.
Can you repeat that?
Sure, I'll withdraw the question and repeat it. Did Janet Arvizo ever complain to you about the Bashir documentary?
Yes, she did.
Approximately when did she complain about that documentary?
In the first conversation I had with her after the documentary.
Okay, would that be in 2003?
Yes.
And what did she say to you?
She said that there had been a documentary aired showing Gavin and her children which she had not given her permission for. She had not given permission for her children to be taped.
And did she say she was going to do anything about it?
No, not that I can remember.
Did Janet ever tell you that David was on drugs?
Yes.
When was this?
After Devellin's graduation.
Did she ever tell you that David was spending all the money they raised on drugs?
She did tell me that he was spending. I wouldn't say, all. She didn't use the word, all, but she said that he was spending some of the money on drugs and to take his family out and show them a good time.
Did she ever tell you that she had spent any of that money?
No.
Okay, let's go to 2003, after the Bashir documentary airs, okay?
Uh-huh.
You have this conversation with Janet about the documentary, right? And when do you talk to her again after she complains about the documentary?
There's no way for me to say. There were many conversations after that initial conversation.
Well, did you talk to her on a regular basis in the year 2003?
In February I did.
Okay, and is there any particular reason why you were talking to her so often in February of 2003?
I think Janet was in over her head, and I don't think she really knew what to do. So I believe that she knew I was always there, at least to listen, you know. And if I could help in any kind of way, she knew I was there. She knew I was good for that.
Did she ever tell you she was looking for an attorney?
No, I don't remember.
Did she ever tell you she was going to do anything about the Bashir documentary?
No, again, like I said, I believe she was in over her head, and I don't think she really knew what to do at that moment. I believe I suggested to her that she should get an attorney.
Okay, did she ever tell you she got one?
No, she never told me she did.
Did she ever tell you she had joined in any complaint in England against the Bashir documentary?
No.
Did Janet ever mention a trip to Brazil to you?
Yes.
What did she say?
She said that they.
All object as hearsay.
Impeachment, Your Honor.
The objections overruled.
She said that they were going to Brazil for Carnival.
And what is Carnival, to your knowledge?
Beautiful costumes, beads. I guess it's kind of like Mardi Gras.
Kind of a holiday celebration, right?
A holiday celebration.
Did she ever ask you to go with her?
Yes, she did.
And when did Janet ask you to go to Brazil with her to attend Carnival?
During a phone conversation. It was sometime in February.
Okay, and did you say anything in response to her invitation?
I said, sure, I'd love to go.
And did you ever talk to her about Brazil again?
Yeah, we talked a couple of times about Brazil.
And did you talk about your going with her?
I'm sure I did. I told her I couldn't go for too long. I was in school at the time, so I would only be able to be there for, like, 3 or 4 days.
Did she say that was okay?
Yes.
Okay, did she seem excited about you going to Brazil with her?
I don't know. I don't know if she was excited. Janet's always excited. She's excited. Either she's excited or she's sad. So it was kind of hard to gauge whether she was excited about me going or this is just during one of the times that she was really happy.
But you had a number of discussions about you and she going to Brazil?
No more than 2, maybe 3. On occasion.
And were all these conversations on the phone?
Yes.
Did she call you or did you call her, if you remember?
I would guess she called me during this time. I didn't really know where they were staying, so my guess is that she called me.
Okay, and do you think this is February of 2003?
I know it was February of 2003.
And did you have any discussions with her about going to Brazil in March of 2003, if you know?
I don't remember.
Okay, did she tell you what she wanted to do in Brazil other than attend Carnival?
No, she didn't say.
Did she seem excited about going to Carnival?
Object. Asked and answered.
Sustained.
Did Janet tell you when Carnival is in Brazil?
No.
But there's no question she mentioned Carnival, right?
Yes.
Did she tell you whether or not her family were going to be at Carnival in Brazil?
Yes.
And what did she say about that?
Well, she said that Michael and I guess his family and their family, they were all going to go to Carnival. That's all she said.
Do you mean Michael Jackson?
Yes.
So she said Michael Jackson and his family are going to Carnival with her?
Yes.
And this is in February of 2003?
This is in February.
Okay. Did she ever tell you that she had learned that Michael Jackson was not going to Brazil?
Yes, I believe she did.
Do you know approximately when that was?
It would have been in early March.
Okay. Was she upset about that?
No.
Okay. Did she still, as far as you know, plan to go to Brazil?
By this time I don't think she wanted to go.
Okay. Did she tell you she didn't want to go because she found out Michael wasn't going?
Object. That's a leading question, Your Honor.
Sustained.
Did Janet tell you why she no longer wanted to go to Brazil?
Because there were a lot of unknowns. Her children had been out of school for 1 month. She didn't know when they were going back to school. She didn't know exactly where she was staying in Brazil.
Did she ever tell you she had cancelled the trip?
No, I don't even remember when we stopped talking about Brazil.
Okay.
It just kind of went away. We didn't talk about it anymore.
Did you learn at some point she never went to Brazil?
No.
Okay. Did she tell you that tickets had never been purchased to go to Brazil?
Had never been purchased?
Yes.
No, she didn't tell me that.
Okay. Now, do you think the last time you talked to Janet was in March of 2003?
Yes.
And where were you when you talked to her in March of 2003?
At my house.
Did Janet ever tell you that Michael Jackson had falsely imprisoned her?
No.
Did Janet ever tell you that Michael Jackson had kept her family against their will?
No.
Did Janet ever tell you that Michael Jackson had extorted her family?
No.
Did Janet ever tell you that Michael Jackson was in a conspiracy to commit crimes against her family?
Absolutely not.
And you were talking to her on a regular basis in February 2003, right?
Yes.
And would that be daily?
I don't remember if it was daily. And again, if I got calls, sometimes they were from Devellin and sometimes they were from Janet.
Okay. Did Devellin ever tell you that the family was being held against their will?
No.
Object as hearsay, Your Honor.
Overruled. The answer was no. Next question.
Did Devellin ever tell you that the family was being falsely imprisoned by Michael Jackson?
No.
Did Devellin ever tell you that her family were the victims of extortion by Michael Jackson?
No.
Did Devellin ever tell you that there was some conspiracy to injure her family?
No.
Did you have any discussions with Gavin during February of 2003?
Yes.
And would he call you or would you call him?
If his sister would call me, he would get on the phone. Normally if Devellin would call, they would all get on the phone.
Okay.
One by one.
And that would include Janet?
Sometimes, no, not all the time. A lot of times during this period Janet had a headache, she would say.
Okay.
They would tell me their mom was lying down.
Okay. Now, when Janet invited you to go to Carnival in Brazil, were the kids around, to your knowledge?
I don't know.
Do you know if the children were on the phone at the same time?
Not the same time, meaning there was more than one phone, no.
Okay. But you think you had 2 or 3 conversations with her about Brazil?
Yes.
Did she ever tell you she was being forced to go to Brazil?
No.
Did Janet say anything about whether or not Jay Jackson was going to go to Brazil with her?
No, she didn't mention it to me.
Okay. And did she express disappointment that Michael Jackson wasn't going to go to Brazil with her?
Your Honor, I object. Asked and answered.
Sustained.
Did Janet Arvizo ever complain to you about Michael Jackson in February of 2003?
No.
Did Janet Arvizo ever complain to you about Michael Jackson in March of 2003?
No.
Now, there was a point in time where you attended an interview between the Arvizo family and some social workers in Los Angeles, right?
Correct.
And did you attend that interview?
Yes, I did.
Why did you do that?
Janet asked me to.
Do you know approximately when she asked you to?
I would say approximately about a week before the interview.
Okay. Do you remember whether she called you or you called her?
Again, I'm sure she called me during that time. They were from place to place, so I had no way of reaching them.
Okay. And was she calling you often during this particular part of February?
Yes.
Would it be correct to say she was calling you on almost a daily basis?
I don't remember.
Could it have been a couple of times a week?
Yeah, several times a week.
Okay. Is there any particular time of day when Janet would call you?
No, all hours of the day.
Okay. And did you consider Janet to be your friend at the time?
Yeah, she was a friend.
You seem to hesitate. Is there a reason?
I mean, she's not someone who I ever hung out with on a one-on-one basis. If the children were around, she's not one of my girlfriends who I would call up and talk about a new CD or a new movie or, most of the conversations we had about 95% I was listening to her or it would be about her children.
Now, when Janet called you in February of 2003, did she ever tell you she was being forced to go to any location?
No.
Did Janet ever tell you she was being forced to get into anyone's car and go anywhere?
No.
Did Janet ever tell you in February of 2003 that her children were being forced to travel to various locations?
No.
By anybody?
No.
Did Janet ever tell you that she was forced to do any interview about Michael Jackson?
Never.
Did Janet ever tell you that her family was forced to rehearse lines that they were then to articulate in an interview about Michael Jackson?
No.
Did Janet ever tell you that she or her family were given scripts to memorize?
No.
For an interview?
No.
Did she ever complain about having to do any interview for a rebuttal documentary?
No. As a matter of fact, she was happy to do the rebuttal video.
Please explain what you mean.
She was very upset about the uproar that had been caused by this documentary. Not only that her children had been taped without permission, but that the relationship, the friendship that her son had with Michael was taken completely out of context and made into something that was bad. She was upset about that.
And she told you that?
She told me that.
Okay, now, when did she tell you she was happy to do an interview for the rebuttal documentary?
Her exact words were not, "I'm happy to do this," but she was very excited about doing it. She was very anxious to do it, to tell the world that this friendship was nothing more than what they saw, a beautiful friendship, and that's it.
She used those words to you?
She's used the word, beautiful friendship, before in regards to Michael, yes. I don't know in this specific conversation if she used it.
Is there anything else she told you about Michael and her family that you remember?
Janet told me the same thing about Michael as she said about Chris and I. She praised Chris and I to the point where it made me uncomfortable, saying that we were sent. We were angels and how we just have done so much for her family. And while I believe that we did provide the children with happiness and maybe love that they were not receiving from the other parent, David, you know, me, as a woman, I feel uncomfortable because I'm only a human being, you know. And I would tell her all the time, Janet, stop. Stop. I'm only doing what anyone else would do with a heart, you know. She praised Chris. She praised myself. She praised Michael.
When she praised Michael, what did she say?
I don't remember exact words, but it was something to the effect of, "What a great man he is, he's an angel, his love is great."
Did she ever refer to you and Chris Tucker as part of her family?
All the time.
What would she say about that?
You are our family. She said it over and over and over. The children said it. I said it. I would call them my Mexican brothers and sisters, because they were like my little brothers and sisters.
Would Gavin say you were part of his family?
Yes.
Would Star?
They called me.
I'm sorry.
They called me, Big Sister.
Okay. Did Star say you were part of the Arvizo family?
Yes.
Would Devellin say you were part of the Arvizo family?
Yes.
Do you recall whether or not Janet said Michael Jackson was part of the Arvizo family?
I'm sure over the 3-year relationship we've had she's mentioned that at some point in time. I don't remember any specific conversation, but I'm sure she has.
Now, during February of 2003, do you recall whether or not Janet ever referred to Michael Jackson as a father figure to the Arvizo family?
Yes.
Now, around the same time, did she refer to Chris Tucker as a father figure to the Arvizo family?
No.
Did she ever refer to Chris as a father figure, to your knowledge?
No.
It was asked and answered, Your Honor.
Sustained.
Now, in 2003, was it your understanding that Gavin was still ill?
No.
Did you learn at some point that he had recovered from his illness?
Yes, I did.
And what did you learn?
After undergoing all of his chemo, I believe his dad told me his cancer had gone into remission. David was still in the picture at this time.
Okay. Did Janet ever tell you words to the effect that Michael Jackson had helped her son overcome his illness?
She mentioned that after the Bashir documentary.
And what did she say about that?
Exactly what you just said, that Michael had helped cure her son, and this is what a beautiful friendship they have.
Now, do you recall? Excuse me, let me rephrase that. Did you learn at some point that Janet and the children were going to be interviewed for a rebuttal documentary to the Bashir program?
Excuse me, yes.
And you just said that she praised Michael for helping her son overcome his illness, right?
Uh-huh.
Now, to your knowledge, was that praise that she gave to Michael Jackson before the family was interviewed for a rebuttal program?
Yes.
And did she say that many times before that interview?
I don't know about many times, but she said it.
More than once?
One time is clear in my head. Once.
Okay.
During the initial conversation that we had after the documentary aired.
Okay. Do you recall when Janet and the children were interviewed for the rebuttal documentary?
Yes.
And what do you remember about that?
I remember it was the night before the interview with the social workers.
Now, Janet asked you to come to the interview with the social workers, right?
Yes.
Did she tell you why?
Why?
She wanted you to be there.
For support. Janet has asked me. Well, first of all, Janet had been interviewed, or the children had been interviewed by social workers before, so Janet was very scared that her children were going to be taken away from her. So I believe that's why she asked me to come, for support.
And did you agree to come?
Yes.
Okay. Did you go to that interview?
Yes, I did.
Was your child with you?
Yes, he was.
Okay. Did you drive to Major Jackson's home for the interview?
I don't know if it was Major Jackson's home, but I drove to an apartment.
And what street was that on?
St. Andrews.
That's in Los Angeles, right?
Yes, near Western.
Okay. And do you know about what time of day you and your child drove there?
It was in the morning. I think about 9 o'clock. 9 a.m. maybe earlier.
Did you park on the street?
Yes. And I got a parking ticket.
Okay. And you then went into the apartment, right?
Yes.
Did you have to go up the stairs to do that?
I took an elevator up.
Okay. And when you first got into the apartment, what did you see?
First of all, I rode up in the elevator with the 3 social workers. I didn't know they were the social workers until I got in the apartment, till we went to the same place. When I got in, I saw Janet and 3 children.
And so you walked in at the same time the social workers did, right?
Yes.
And what's the next thing you remember seeing?
Oh, and there was another guy there. I don't know his name. The first thing that I saw, Janet was talking to the social workers.
Okay. Did you hear what she said?
I don't remember.
And you met the social workers, obviously.
Yes.
And did you talk to the social workers at all?
Briefly, yes.
And what did you say to them, if you remember?
We were introduced.
By who? I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
We were introduced, and they were commenting about how cute my son is. Because he really is cute.
That's why I let you say it.
And do you remember anybody showing a video?
Yes.
What do you remember about that?
I remember. I don't know who put it in, if the kids put it in or Janet, but the video was of Michael Jackson and Gavin when Gavin was very ill. He was undergoing chemo at the time. You could tell he was very weak, very pale, little to no hair. At times I don't think he was walking. I think Michael was maybe pushing him around in a wheelchair. And there was a part of them where Gavin kind of just plops on a blanket. You could tell he was just so weak he can't really just sit down. He kind of just falls. His knees buckle, and they're by a lake. And that's it.
And you watched that with the social workers and Janet and the Arvizo children?
Yes.
Okay. Do you know whose idea it was to watch that video?
I believe. Yeah, I think it was Janet's.
Okay. Excuse me. Let me rephrase the question. After you all watched the video, what happened next?
After the video, I believe that's when the interview started and I was asked to leave. My son and I were asked to leave.
And who asked you to leave?
One of the social workers.
And did you leave?
I did, but Janet put up a fight. She wanted me to stay.
Okay. When you say she put up a fight, now, What do you mean?
She said, absolutely not. Asha is our family and I want her here.
And did you see Janet have a discussion like that for a while?
For about a minute.
And what was the result of that discussion?
The social workers told her she understood that, but, you know, I guess by law, that no one else outside of the family could be present.
Okay, and then what did you do?
I told Janet it was okay, and I would go wait outside. And as soon as she was done, come get me.
Did you go wait outside?
Yes.
How long do you think you waited outside?
Well, I went and got something to eat. And I came back, and it was still another hour and a half, so it was altogether maybe 2 hours.
And then did you go back in?
Yes.
And what did you see when you went back in?
A completely different scene from the beginning. Everyone was hugging each other. And it was like the tension had left the room. You could tell that everyone was happy.
And when you say, everyone, who are you referring to?
The kids and Janet, and the social workers.
Okay.
It was very tense at first when the social workers first arrived. It was very tense. And by the end of the interview, it was a completely different scene.
And at the end of the interview, what did you do?
I stayed around for a while.
Okay. Did you stay with Janet and the children? Alright, now, you made a comment about Janet having a prior experience with the Department of Children and Family Services, right?
Yes.
And what were you referring to?
Your Honor, I'm going to object. Lack of foundation and calls for hearsay. No personal.
Sustained.
Were you ever with Janet before this particular time when she had an experience with the Department of Children and Family Services?
No, I was not with Janet. I was with the children.
And when was this?
It's unclear to me if it was in December of 2001 or early 2002. It was somewhere around that time, though.
And you say you were with the children?
Yes, I went to visit them at the apartment.
Okay, which apartment now?
The one near downtown.
Okay, was that on Soto Street?
I believe so.
Was that in East Los Angeles?
Yeah, I think East LA.
And why were you at the apartment that day?
I went to visit, to check on them. This was during a time that Janet and I were talking a lot on the phone, and she had told me about the abuse from her husband, and I was worried about them. And I'm a very spiritual person, as well as Janet is, so I went over to pray with her.
Did you do that?
She wasn't there.
Were the children there?
Yes.
Were they alone?
They were alone. And they told me that the
Your Honor, I'm going to object. It's non-responsive and it's hearsay.
Sustained. I'll strike after she said, they were alone.
Did you stay at the home that day?
I stayed for a couple of hours.
Okay. Did you ever see Janet that day?
No.
Why did you go to the home that day?
For support.
That's asked and answered.
Overruled. You may answer.
For support, did you say?
For support and to pray with her.
And you mentioned that this had some relationship with the Department of Children and Family Services?
Yes. Prior to me getting there, the children told me that a social worker or two, I don't know, had come to their apartment.
On that day?
On that day.
And was the mother not home that day?
She was not home, and she had given the children instructions not to answer the door, but Star had let them in.
Okay. And you never saw Janet that day at all?
Nope.
Your Honor, I'm going to object as asked and answered.
Overruled. Next question.
Okay. Now, to your knowledge, was Chris Tucker visiting the Arvizo family at their home?
No.
Do you know if he ever has done that?
Not to my knowledge, no.
Okay. The day that you attended the interview with 3 social workers at St. Andrew's Place, did you speak to Janet or the children before the interview?
Meaning that day did I speak to them?
Yes.
No.
Do you know if you spoke to Janet or the children the day before that interview?
Yes, I spoke to them the night before.
Okay.
When they were doing the rebuttal video.
And did you talk to Janet?
Yes. She called me.
Do you know where she called you from?
From wherever they were doing the video.
And did she ever tell you she didn't want to do the video?
No.
Did she tell you she wanted to do it?
Your Honor, object. Asked and answered.
Not this particular time.
Overruled. Connect the time.
Sure. We're talking about the night that Janet and the children did the rebuttal interview, okay?
Uh-huh.
This is the night before your meeting with the Department of Children and Family Services, all right?
Yes.
You say Janet called you?
Yes.
And did Janet ever complain about anything in that call?
No. She seemed happy. Whoever's house they were at, she put them on the phone and introduced us.
Your Honor, I'm going to object to anything beyond, no. Move to strike.
Sustained. Stricken.
In that phone call, did Janet put anyone else on the phone?
Yes.
Do you know who it was?
I'm trying to think of the name. It was an interesting name. I don't remember. It was like, I want to say like an Arabic name or something. I don't know.
Did you talk to this person?
Yes.
How long did you talk to Janet in that call, if you remember?
I don't remember. It wasn't a long conversation, though.
But she called you and seemed happy?
Uh-huh.
Did she ever ask you to call the police because they were being held against their will?
No.
Did Janet ever tell you they were being falsely imprisoned? Please help.
No.
Did she sound like she was in any kind of trouble in that call?
No.
Did you talk about the social worker's interview the next day?
I believe that's when she gave me the address of where it was going to take place.
And did you agree on a time that you would be at the St. Andrews address for the next day?
Yes, she told me what time the interview started.
Okay. Now, you said that when the interview was completed, you went back into the apartment, and you hung around for a while?
Yes.
Did the children seem happy?
Not happy. Just like their normal selves. I don't know. They might have been even watching TV.
Did Janet seem happy?
Yes.
Did you talk to Janet?
Not much.
At some point, did you leave that apartment on St. Andrew's Place after the interview with the social workers?
Yes.
And where did you go?
I went to Neverland.
Why did you go to Neverland?
The children asked me. The children and their mother asked me to take them.
And you agreed to do that?
Yes.
And did you drive the 3 children to Neverland?
Yes. And my son.
Okay, now, did Janet ask you to take them to Neverland after the interview?
Yes.
Did she ask you to take them to Neverland while she was in the apartment on St. Andrew's Place?
Yes.
Did she tell you why she wanted you to take the children to Neverland?
I assumed that's where they were staying.
At this point, had Janet ever told you that she was forced to escape imprisonment at Neverland?
No.
At this point in time, had Janet ever told you she ever escaped from Neverland?
No.
Did Janet tell you how she was going to get to Neverland on that day?
Object. Calls for speculation. Conclusion.
Overruled. You may answer.
Can you repeat that?
Sure. You agreed to take the Arvizo children and your son to Neverland, right?
Correct.
This is after the interview with the social workers?
Yes.
Did you have an understanding where Janet was going to be?
Yes. A young man came to the house, and Janet told me that they were going to retrieve some birth certificates to get their passports.
Was that for the Brazil trip?
I assumed it was.
Did she ever complain to you about the Brazil trip?
Your Honor, I'm going to object as asked and answered.
Sustained.
Vague as to time.
Sustained.
After the interview with the 3 social workers.
Yes.
When you were in the apartment on St. Andrew's Place, did Janet ever complain about the Brazil trip?
Yes.
What did she say?
This was in a conversation about 2 or 3 weeks later.
I'm talking about this particular day now.
Oh, no, not that day.
Did she say anything negative about the Brazil trip on that day?
No, she seemed eager to go to get the birth certificates to take care of the passport situation. And she told me she'd come to Neverland after that.
Okay, now, you drove to Neverland after that?
Uh-huh.
took the children to Neverland?
Uh-huh.
And about what time do you think you arrived at Neverland?
About 3 o'clock.
And what did you do when you arrived at Neverland around 3 o'clock?
What do you do when you go to Neverland? You do everything. I mean, I probably got on the bumper cars. I don't know. I turn into, like, a child. I turn into a child when I go to Neverland. I maybe got on the Ferris wheel. I don't know. I was all over the place.
On that particular day?
Yes.
So you were essentially playing with the children at Neverland, right?
Yes.
At some point, did you see Janet at Neverland that day?
No.
Okay, when did you next see Janet Arvizo?
I never saw her again.
Did you ever talk to her again?
Yes, I did. On the phone.
When was that?
The only time I remember, the only time that's clear in my head is a phone conversation we had 2 to 3 weeks after this interview with the social workers.
Okay, we'll get to that. Did you leave the Arvizo children at Neverland?
Yes.
Okay, and where did you leave them, if you remember?
What do you mean, where did I leave them?
Did you leave them in the main house? Did you leave them in the guest units? What went on?
I believe we were in the main house.
Okay, did you talk to Janet while you were at Neverland?
No.
What time do you think you left that day?
I spent the night that day, and that was a Thursday. I did not leave until about 10 or 11 o'clock Friday night.
Okay, so Thursday night you stayed at Neverland, right?
I stayed overnight, yes.
Did you see Michael Jackson there?
No.
Did you see Michael Jackson the next day?
No.
Do you know where the Arvizo children stayed that night?
No.
Where did you stay?
In a guest unit.
Okay, did someone bring you to the guest unit at Neverland?
I think I walked over there.
Okay, and the next day you got up in the morning?
Yes.
And what did you do?
Ate breakfast.
Okay, was that in the main house?
Yes.
Did you just walk into the main house?
I don't remember. I can't remember someone letting me in. I think the door is locked or something. I think someone let me in.
And did you go to the kitchen area?
Yes.
Did you sit at the counter?
Yes.
And were there some cooks on the other side of the counter?
Yes.
And you just ordered breakfast and had breakfast right there, right?
Yes.
And your son was with you?
Yes.
What did you do after breakfast?
I don't remember.
Okay.
Oh, I do remember. We fed elephants.
Okay.
And the birds and things like that.
Were the Arvizo children with you?
Yes, they were.
Did they meet you in the main house?
I believe they called me. And they were the ones to tell me, kind of, hurry and get up and come over here.
Do you think you met them at the main house?
Yes.
Did they have breakfast with you?
Yes, they did.
Okay, and that's, after breakfast, you all fed the elephants?
Uh-huh.
Okay, how long were you at Neverland that day?
Until I left, which was about 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock that night.
Okay, and did you ever see Janet that day?
No.
Okay, were you with the Arvizo children during the entire day?
Yes.
Were you with them that evening before you left?
Yes.
Okay, did you have lunch and dinner with them?
I believe so, yes.
And did you ever see Michael Jackson there?
No, he wasn't there.
Okay, how did you find that out?
There were other children there. There were other guests there who said that he wasn't there.
Did you know what the other guests' names were?
Marie Nicole, Baby Rubba, and I don't remember the older brother's name. And Marlon Brando's son and his 3 kids.
Okay, now, if you know, where were Marlon Brando's son and his 3 kids staying?
I don't know.
Do you know where the other children were staying?
I don't know.
Was their name Cassio, if you know?
I don't know.
Okay, when you went around Neverland, were you with the other children as well?
Yes.
So you were with Marie Nicole?
Uh-huh.
And Baby Rubba?
Uh-huh.
And the third person?
No, the older one, who was probably about 15 or 16. I don't know. Maybe even older, he was kind of just doing his own thing.
Okay.
He wasn't with us at that time.
Were the Brando children with you?
No, they were on the quads.
Okay. They were on the quads driving around?
Uh-huh.
Okay. So you leave about 11 o'clock at night, right?
Uh-huh.
You went home?
Yes.
Did Janet ever complain to you about the way the media was treating her?
I don't remember.
Did she ever say words to the effect that her family was being hassled by the media?
Your Honor, I'm going to object as leading and suggestive.
Sustained.
After the Bashir documentary aired, did you ever discuss the media with Janet?
Your Honor, I'm going to object. It's hearsay and it's asked and answered on the prior question.
I don't think so.
The word was, ever.
It's a time difference. Go ahead. You may answer. If you'd like it read back, we can do that.
Please.
After the Bashir documentary aired, did you ever discuss the media with Janet?
Yes.
And did you say anything to Janet about the media?
Not that I can remember.
Did she say anything to you about the media?
She did. But I don't remember what she said.
Okay. Did Janet ever tell you anything to the effect that the media was following her?
Your Honor, I'm going to object as leading.
Sustained.
Suggestive.
Sustained.
Okay. Did Janet ever say anything to you about getting a body wax?
No.
Did she say anything to you about Michael Jackson paying for her children's dental work?
No. May I go back to one of those questions to follow up? Janet never mentioned anything that I can remember about the media following her, but Devellin did.
And what did Devellin say?
Devellin.
Excuse me. Object as hearsay.
Sustained.
How many times have you discussed the media with Devellin?
I don't remember how many times.
Was it more than once?
Yes.
Okay. Was this during your phone conversations with Devellin?
During the initial conversation with Devellin.
Was this about the same time that Devellin was asking for a car?
No, this was before.
Okay. I think you said this, but I don't remember. I apologize. Do you remember when the last conversation you had with Devellin was when she asked for a car?
I don't remember.
It was in 2003, right?
It was in 2003, yes.
Okay. So you leave Neverland at about 11 o'clock, right?
10 o'clock or 11 o'clock.
The Arvizo children remain at Neverland, right?
Yes.
And to your knowledge, Michael Jackson is not at Neverland, right?
Right.
When do you next talk to any member of the Arvizo family, if you recall?
The next day or so. Maybe Saturday or Sunday.
Who did you talk to?
Devellin.
Did Devellin call you?
Yes.
Do you know where Devellin was when she called you?
At Neverland.
How long did you talk to Devellin on that occasion?
I don't remember.
Okay. When did you next talk to Janet?
I can't remember.
Did Janet ever talk to you about some German people?
Yes.
I'm going to object. Vague as to time.
I'll ask when.
All right.
When did Janet first talk to you about some German people?
I don't remember the first conversation when she first talked to me about them.
Was it in the year 2003?
Yes.
And did she call you the first time she mentioned some German people?
I'm sure she did.
Okay. And do you remember what she said about them?
She didn't like them.
Did she tell you why?
They were rude. They said mean things to her. She didn't elaborate what mean things they said, but she just did not care for them at all. And it was obvious that they didn't care for her.
Did she ever complain that these German people were keeping her away from Michael Jackson?
Yes.
What did she say?
It was in an answer following a question that I asked her. I asked her, with all the mean things they were saying, I said, "Does Michael know anything about this?" And she said, "No, they won't let us around him, because they know that the children tug at his heartstrings."
Tug at whose heartstrings?
Michael's.
Okay. Now, was this conversation about the German people after the interview with the 3 social workers?
Yes, this conversation in particular I'm talking about was 2 to 3 weeks after the social worker's interview.
Was that the first time you had spoken to Janet since the social worker's interview?
I don't know if it's the first time, but it's the only time that's clear in my head right now.
Did Janet tell you where she was during that discussion?
She was at Neverland.
Okay, and do you know whether or not her children were at Neverland when you had that conversation?
Yes.
Did you ever learn whether or not Janet went back to Neverland to be with her children after the interview with the social workers?
Can you repeat that?
Sure. After the interview with the social workers, you took the children to Neverland?
Uh-huh.
And did you ever learn that Janet went to Neverland to be with the children?
After I took them there?
Yes.
In the phone conversation I had with Gavin following my time at Neverland, I don't remember her mentioning her mother being there. I don't remember her mentioning her mother not being there. I can't remember that.
So you don't really know if Janet went back to Neverland after the interview with the social workers?
I know she went back at some point. I just don't know when.
Okay, and I think you said the next time you spoke to Janet, it was your understanding she was at Neverland, right?
I know she was at Neverland.
How do you know?
Because she told me.
Okay.
And because whenever I have Privacy Manager or something like that, Neverland Valley Ranch shows up on my caller ID.
Okay, approximately when do you think you had the conversation with Janet at Neverland that you just described?
I'll say it was anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks after that interview with the social workers.
Okay, did Janet talk about the German people in that discussion?
Yes.
What did she say?
She didn't like them.
Did she elaborate?
I'm sure she did, but I don't remember exactly what she said about them. It was a very long conversation, so I don't remember exactly what she said about the German people.
Okay, and she mentioned Brazil in that conversation?
Yes.
Did she say she wasn't going?
She said she didn't want to go.
Okay, and did she mention in that conversation that she learned Michael Jackson wasn't going to Brazil?
Not that I can remember, no.
Okay, did she complain about Michael Jackson in that conversation?
No.
Did Janet ever complain to you about Michael Jackson?
Never.
Did she say nice things about Michael in that conversation?
No.
Did she really talk about him?
I'm sorry?
Did she talk about Michael in that conversation, if you remember?
The only instance that I remember her mentioning Michael's name is when she said that they would not allow the children around, her and the children around Michael.
Okay, and that was in February of 2003 or March of 2003.
I believe it was March of 2003.
Okay, and that conversation, excuse me, in that conversation, was it your understanding that Janet was at Neverland?
I know she was at Neverland.
Okay, now, did you ever talk to Devellin about whether or not she had any friends she used to be with at Neverland?
Devellin talked about Marie Nicole a lot.
And what did she say about her?
Your Honor, I'm going to object as hearsay.
Sustained.
Was it your understanding, based upon your discussions with Devellin, that Marie Nicole was her friend?
Yes.
Did you ever see Devellin at Neverland with Marie Nicole?
Yes.
On how many occasions do you think?
When I drove to Neverland after the interview, she told me about Marie Nicole on the way there, and that we would meet her once we got there. And once we arrived, Marie Nicole was there.
Okay, and did you see Devellin hang out with Marie Nicole at Neverland?
Yeah, we all kind of hung together.
Okay, in the conversation with Janet in March that you have just described, did she ever tell you that her family had been held against their will at Neverland?
No.
In that conversation with Janet in March, did she ever say that her family had been falsely imprisoned?
No.
In that conversation with Janet in March, did she ever say that her family were the victims of extortion?
No.
And in that conversation with Janet in March of 2003, did she ever say that she or her family were forced to escape from Neverland?
No, I'm sorry.
Why are you smiling?
I mean, it's Neverland. I don't really know who would want to escape Neverland. It's just a fun place.
Okay.
But, no, she never said that.
Okay, now, you've indicated that Janet would speak to you for long periods of time, right?
Yes.
And what, when you say a long period of time, What do you mean?
Sometimes an hour or two.
And is this in the year 2003?
This is pretty much from the start of us talking on the phone until the last conversation we had.
Did Janet ever complain to you that Michael Jackson had molested her children?
No.
And when do you think the last conversation you had with Janet was?
In March of 2003.
Do you have any idea what part of March that was?
I'll say early March.
So in early March, she told you that the German people wouldn't let her children see Michael Jackson?
Your Honor, I'm going to object. Asked and answered.
Sustained.
With the court's permission, I'd like to approach the witness, if I may, Your Honor, to show some exhibits.
All right.
They would be Defense Exhibits 5090, 5091, 5092, 5093 and 5094. They are photographs with writings on the back, and I have showed them to the prosecution.
All right.
Thank you.
Just let me see them a minute.
Miss Pryor, I'm showing you the exhibits I just described, and I'd like you to first look at Defense Exhibit 5090, okay?
Okay.
Have you seen that photograph before?
Yes.
And where have you seen that photograph?
At my house.
And how did you ever see that photograph?
It was mailed to me, along with other photographs.
Okay, and do you know who mailed it to you?
The children did.
Okay, would you please read what's on the back of that photograph?
Sure.
Well, Your Honor, it's not in evidence yet, so I'd object. But to save some time, I'll just indicate to the court, I'll stipulate to the admissibility of all these, just to make the record clear.
You're offering all of them?
We are.
They're admitted.
If I can approach, I'll just put them all in front of the witness, then. Will you please read what's on the back of the first exhibit?
Hi, Asha. I am sending you a picture of us so when we are not with you, you can see us. I love you, Asha. Your little guy, Gavin Arvizo.
Do you know if Gavin sent that to you?
I'm assuming he did.
And when did you receive it?
I don't know.
Okay, do you know which year?
I don't remember.
Okay, could you read the back of each exhibit in front of you?
Sure.
Tell us the number you're reading.
Oh, sorry, 5091. This one is for Chris. It says, Chris, this is a picture for you to remember us always, and when you are far away from us you can see us. I love you, Chris. See you soon, big bro. Your little bro, Gavin Arvizo.
Okay.
5092. Hi, Boo Boo. That's my son's nickname. Hi, Boo Boo. This is your big brother. Now you can see us all the time. I love you, Boo Boo, and I miss you. Your big brother, Gavin Arvizo. 5093. Dear Asha, I give this to you with love. I love you. Love, your little brother, forever, star. 5094. Dear Chris, I love you and miss you with all my heart. Love, star David Arvizo.
Now, these are all photographs of the Arvizo children, right?
Yes.
And were they mailed to you at once or did you get them periodically?
No, they all were mailed at one time.
And do you know approximately when that was?
No.
Okay.
Sometime during our friendship.
Okay. Now, in March of 2003, did you speak to any of the Arvizo children?
Yes.
Who did you speak to in March of 2003?
I spoke to the 3 children.
And when you spoke to them, did you know where they were?
I don't remember.
Did any of the children ever complain about Michael Jackson to you?
No.
Did Janet Arvizo ever mention someone named Jamie Masada to you?
Yes.
And when did she mention Jamie Masada to you?
I've been hearing Jamie's name since I believe the first day I met the children. And subsequently, after that, when I would speak on the phone to their mother.
Did Janet ever mention to you that Jamie Masada was a close friend?
Yes.
Did she ever mention to you in February of 2003 that Jamie Masada had taken her to an attorney?
No.
Did Janet mention to you at any time in February of 2003 that she had seen an attorney named Bill Dickerman?
I believe so.
Okay, and do you know when she told you that?
I don't remember. It's not so clear in my head, but I do remember her mentioning the name Bill Dickerman.
Do you know when she mentioned Dickerman?
No, I don't know.
Okay. Did she ever tell you that Jamie Masada had taken her? Excuse me. Let me rephrase that. Did she ever tell you that Jamie Masada introduced her to attorney Bill Dickerman?
I don't remember.
Okay. Did Janet ever tell you that Jamie Masada and attorney Bill Dickerman had introduced her to attorney Larry Feldman?
No.
Now, when you were at Neverland, right after the interview with the social workers.
Uh-huh.
This is the day you drove the children there when Michael wasn't there. Do you recall whether or not the Arvizo children ever asked to stay in Michael Jackson's room?
Yes.
And did you hear them make that request?
Yes, I did.
Where were they when they made that request?
Maybe in the kitchen. I can't remember.
Do you know who they asked if they could stay in Michael Jackson's room when Michael wasn't there?
I believe his name is Joe. He's the guy who's always there.
And do you recall what he said?
He said no.
And do you know where the kids stayed? Excuse me, the Arvizo children stayed that night?
Your Honor, that's been asked and answered.
Sustained.
Did you ever learn that a rebuttal documentary with Maury Povich appeared on television?
Yes, we watched it that night.
And who is we?
It was myself and my son, the 3 children, Marie Nicole, Marlon Brando's son, and I don't know if some of his children were there or not.
Did you watch the rebuttal show with Maury Povich at Neverland?
Yes.
Okay. And did you notice that the Arvizos were not in that show?
Yes.
Did you say Janet was there?
No, she was not.
Okay. Just a few more questions. May I just take a minute, Your Honor, just to.
Yes.
Do you recall Janet ever discussing whether or not Michael Jackson was going to set up a college fund for her children?
Can you repeat that?
Sure. Do you recall whether or not Janet ever discussed words to the effect that Michael was going to set up a college fund for her children?
Yes.
When did this discussion take place?
I believe it was in the conversation that I had with her 2 or 3 weeks after the interview. We covered many grounds during that phone conversation.
This is after the interview.
With the social workers.
Okay. Did she tell you that she thought a college fund was being set up for her son?
No, she didn't tell me that there was a college fund being set up. She said there was mention of a college fund.
And did she want one?
No.
What did she say?
Her exact words were she doesn't even know if her son is going to be alive in 10 years. What is a college fund going to do for him?
Did she say she wanted anything?
She didn't say she wanted anything.
Okay. Did you think she was suggesting she wanted money?
Your Honor, I'm going to object. Calls for opinion, speculation.
Sustained.
Did you ever have a discussion with Janet about her hiring a lawyer to sue the people who did the Bashir documentary?
Yes. I asked her. I'm sorry. Just one moment. I don't know if I asked her if she has an attorney and whether she should look into legal action against Martin Bashir, but I asked her, has anyone spoke on compensating you for this? And that's when she mentioned the college fund to me.
But did she indicate she wanted compensation of any kind, to you?
She indicated that a college fund wasn't going to do her son any good when he might not even be alive in 10 years.
Okay. Did you suggest to her that she get an attorney to try to get compensation?
I may have. I don't remember clearly, but I probably did.
Did Janet ever talk to you about whether she should sign a release form?
I asked her did she sign a release form.
And when was this?
During the same conversation.
Okay. And again, when did this conversation take place?
2 to 3 weeks after the interview.
Okay. And did she say she had signed a release?
No.
Did she say she hadn't?
Yes, she said she had not signed one.
Okay. Did you have any further discussion with Janet about the fact that her family had been interviewed?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Yes. Did you have?
I'm going to object to the question as assuming facts not in evidence with regard to, can't do any more than that, but it's unclear, vague as to time, and also as to which conversation.
I think it is vague. I'll rephrase it. After the interview with the 3 social workers, and after the Arvizo family had been interviewed for the rebuttal show, did you have any further discussion with Janet about that rebuttal show?
No.
Did you ever talk to Janet about the fact that you watched the Maury Povich rebuttal show with her children?
No, not that I can remember.
So do you recall Janet ever commenting on that show at any time?
No.
Did Janet ever mention anything to you about phone calls being monitored at Neverland?
No.
Ever tell you she thought she couldn't talk because her phone calls were being listened into?
No.
Did Janet ever talk to you about going shopping?
No.
Did Devellin ever mention the names of any young women who went to Neverland with her?
No.
Ever mention the name of a woman named Adriana?
Your Honor, I'm going to object as leading and suggestive.
I didn't hear the end of the question.
I'll restate it. To your knowledge, did Gavin ever invite a female to Neverland?
Yes.
And when was this?
This was before the interview with the social workers.
Okay, and how did you learn about that?
They told me about it.
Who is they?
Gavin and Devellin and Star.
And
I'm going to move to strike based on hearsay.
Stricken. Let's take a break.